Hello, hello. I see we've got about 9 people in so far. Good morning or good afternoon if you're in Europe or elsewhere than the US. As we get people kind of trickled in, I know it's early on the West Coast where I'm based out of in San Diego. I thought I'd just make some small talks, chit chat. If you want to chat in the chat box on the right side, go ahead and post in there. But I am Ben Dutter. I'm the Senior Vice President of Strategy here at Power Digital, and we are big fans of Rockerbox. And Rockerbox was kind enough to invite me to chat through some measurement strategies and media planning strategies and validation for specifically around how to prepare for Q4. And if you are in an e-commerce business, like most of my clients are, or in a business where you have natural seasonality around Q4, we're right at the tail end of Q3 here. And so it's sort of the last ditch effort you have to validate and prepare for anything. But hey, Ashish, yeah, good to chit chat. I appreciate you being a fan of that. If you ever want to get in a heated debate with my spicy takes, go ahead and follow me on LinkedIn and you'll get plenty. I post a few times a week there. So, all right, well, we've got about 20 people here. So let's get into it. So today we'll talk about diversified measurement and how to prep for Q4 and some kind of quick wins and some longer strategic plays that you can do to validate your marketing measurement. So let's get going. So Q4 success, really we believe and we've seen is really built during Q3. And actually in the last couple of years post-COVID, the Q4 seasonality has become more diffuse. It's been spread out over an earlier period of time. And some people even joke like Q4 really starts at Labor Day in the US, which is in September. And so there's kind of a cyclical nature where competition, in order to get an earlier mind share and an earlier wallet share, they start earlier and earlier in the year. And so you're seeing earlier promotions, you're seeing earlier expenditures, you're seeing earlier spikes of media and marketing programs in September and October, and really to try to capture. And one thing that's interesting is I have data around about 500 e-commerce brands and that we work with at Power. And of those brands, we see the overwhelming majority that have Q4 seasonality. So they have a Black Friday, Cyber Monday period. Their highest lifetime value customer is actually the customer acquired in October. So I'll say that again. The highest LTV or LTR customer is acquired in October. And the reason for that is that those October customers tend to be very likely to repeat purchase in the peak kind of seasonality again, the promo period again in November and December. And so we see that a lot where some brands it's meaningful, where LTV for a typical customer is maybe $80, $100, something like that. But then our October cohort is $200. So it can be really significant. And so for us, really knowing what is going to drive those valuable customers, how do we actually acquire that revenue and capture that demand in Q4? A lot of that needs to be vetted as early as possible. And Q3 is really the last time to do that. And even a little bit into October, how can you validate and prepare for some of those bigger spikes that you're going to be pushing during Black Friday, Cyber Monday, and the holiday season? So let's get into that. What's the point of marketing measurement? So measurement, the whole purpose of measuring anything is so that you get that information to make better decisions. And really the decision that we're talking about within the marketing ecosystem, and particularly in paid marketing, so advertising, things like that, it's really to do two things. Number one, it's to make money. We do marketing so we can make some money. We want to get new customers in the door. We want to make them more successful, more valuable, more profitable customers for us. And so how do we generate marketing effects that actually create revenue for us? And the term there that you'll probably hear me say a lot today is incrementality. So what is successfully driving incremental revenue to the business? And then number two is the flip of that, but just as important or arguably more important is to identify waste. And in many marketing programs, I would say that a plurality or even a majority of advertising spend is allocated wastefully. And so if you're a business where you are margin conscious, you don't have endless VC funding or something like that, you're bootstrapped or you're private equity backed, or you're really, just being responsible with your financial P&L, you really want to identify and eliminate as much waste as possible. Even if you are a growth conscious brand and you're just trying to grow at all costs, why would you waste your money? Wouldn't you want to identify areas of opportunity to cut and things that aren't working and reallocate those funds back into that first group, those things that we do know and have validated are working? So that's the whole thesis of measurement when it comes to marketing. What is working and what's not working, and how do we maximize number one and minimize number two? And so why do we need to diversify measurement? For a long time prior to the digital era, measurement was pretty simple. There wasn't a lot to measure, and the sort of the promise of digital and performance marketing is that it was a lot easier to track and it was a lot easier to measure things. This is probably not a new talk track for any of you. I assume if you're on this Rockerbox webinar and you are familiar with me or you're familiar with diversified measurement, this is not a new thing. But I think a lot of people forget how significant of a change it has been in the last, really the last year or two, compared to what it was 10, 15 years ago. But it's really more of a reset back to what it was in the pre-digital era. So there's a lot less ability for us to track users because of the data deprecation systems that are happening, whether that's through technology or regulation. But I actually argue that even with really, really precise tracking, quote unquote, the user behavior that is most impactful is not actually the click, it's the exposure to the ad. And only 2% of all digital ads get clicked on. That's even of the clickable kind. There's another whole cohort of ads that are not digital, that are not clickable, like television, or certain digital ads that don't make sense to click on if they're more like a video or something like that. So in a lot of cases, you see, the overwhelming impact of various marketing channels gets underrepresented in click-centric tracking because there's still a psychological impact from the exposure to the ad, even if the user didn't click on it and purchase right away. So those three things, obviously there's a technology component, there's regulation component, but then there's the user behavior and kind of psychological component that's just as important and just as impactful for us as marketers to remember that we want to measure accurately the entire impact of our marketing program, not just a single narrow slice of it. So when you start drilling down into that, okay, well, how do you measure that then, Ben? What's sort of the way that you look at that specifically? I look at it as a spectrum. And on the left-hand side of the spectrum is where most, especially e-commerce brands, over-index, which is on easily trackable, fast, and more tactical KPIs. Those are all important things. You need to be able to make small micro tweaks. You need to be able to make granular optimizations. You need to make day-to-day, hour-to-hour decisions in real time. Totally on board with that. That's important. But as the farther to the right on the spectrum you get, the more impactful, the more slow, and the more strategic your measurement methods are. So you start off on the far left, leading indicator, something would be like spend. I'm spending more. That's a leading indicator that I'm going to generate more revenue, or maybe impressions or delivery, something like that. If you're a TV buyer, it might be GRPs or something, right? An in-platform KPI is something that you would see traditionally like in Meta ads or Google ads. What's the kind of in-platform attribution that it's getting? Maybe not even an attribution, but just something that's like another step away from a leading indicator. So if it's clicks or click-through rate or views or view-through rate, things like that. An attributed KPI would be something like using Rockerbox or another tool. Most brands that are just starting out will use something like Google Analytics to try to tie back. It's more of a neutral third party that tries to tie back and assign credit retroactively based on that user behavior. Traditionally, and not entirely, and Rockerbox actually done a lot of work to avoid this, but traditionally that attributed KPI is going to be click-centric. So something that is not digital or not clickable is going to be undervalued versus things that are clickable and digital. But the two in the purple box is really what we're focusing on today. They're slower, but they are a commitment to strategic value and scientific rigor. And there's really kind of two versions of that: experimentation and data science and modeling. And we'll get into some details around how to actually do those. But I recommend that brands that need to do all 5 types of these KPIs in order to make decisions. And so when you're doing those multiple KPIs, how do you prioritize that? You're probably very likely to have one method of KPI contradict with another method of KPI. So what's the prioritization framework that you need to use when that inevitably is going to happen? And I see it happen literally every day with brands that I work with. And so I like handy acronyms. They're just fun to say and easy to remember. So we came up with a Power Digital Beats, and it's a priority from left to right. So any kind of KPI that's bucketed farther to the left will supersede or take precedent over a KPI that's farther down to the right in this left to right acronym. And so what that stands for is business, experiments, analyses, technology, tracking is also a good alternative, and surveys. And in order from left to right, the reason why that's important is your business financials and your P&L are the most important KPI that you have. What's your contribution margin? What's your customer acquisition costs? Simply, what's your revenue for the day or for the month or whatever period it is? What's my cash flow? That should be the main source of truth for you in terms of how things are going. The number two is scientific experiments. And I use the word experiments very intentionally. It's not testing, because testing has become kind of a catch-all term for just, oh yeah, we'll throw it in a test. That's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about actual rigorous scientific test and control groups, and we'll talk about that through experimentation. Those take precedent over everything else in terms of measurement. Analyses, which is your data science, your media mix models, which Rockerbox actually has got a great program with their new MMM model inside of that. Any sort of causal impact, Bayesian technology, or ridge hierarchy, any of those kinds of things are helpful. Media mix models traditionally, prior to kind of this recent new wave of more agile MMM, like what's in Rockerbox, used to take months or years to get, and they were very kind of labor intensive, right? But the MMMs of today are a lot more based on machine learning and kind of automated technologies and things like that, and so you're able to get them quicker. However, they maybe lack some business context, and they're always going to be retroactive. Technology is more traditional digital attribution, right? Tracking, tagging, exposures. You're using an ad platform, you're using Rockerbox MTA, you're using an ad server like Campaign Manager, something, floodlight tags, etc. And then finally, surveys. And some people would argue that surveys should go higher in this food chain. The reason why I put it at the end here is I like it as a nice catch-all layer. It's more of a qualitative, rich zero-party data layer from customers. And so there's a lot of value to surveys outside of just measurement. But in the framework of measurement, you see with surveys a lot where people will say, oh, yeah, I heard about you on TikTok. And it's like, well, I don't even have TikTok ads running. So there's some natural bias and complications there. So validation is important. And the validation component is really the piece that I want to index on today, because I think most people get these other three. The business P&L, sure. Technology tracking, yeah, it's been around for 15 plus years. Surveys, sure, not that complicated. Post-purchase survey, how'd you hear about a survey, focus groups, all that stuff is tried and true, right? But the experimentation piece and the analysis piece, also a long-standing legacy process, right? They've been around for years and years, decades and decades, but they're becoming more and more important again and more common. And the brands that I work with that are growing, high double figure or triple figure year over year growth. And we're not talking little brands here. We're talking, mid 8-figure brands that are doubling year over year. It's because they're driving a lot of that through a combination of experimentation validation and retroactive application for analyses, such as within Rockerbox MMM. So all of these add up together into this methodology that I call triangulation. And triangulation really is just the theory of, you want to see where there's strong overlap. Anybody that says, hey, there's a single silver bullet solution that's going to solve your measurement problems is probably selling something or misinformed. And that's an uncomfortable situation. People used to feel more comfortable making a decision off of fewer data points. But because now the data sets are so fragmented and the methodologies are so challenged in the current technological and regulatory environments, you really have to be comfortable as a marketer and as a measurement practitioner to utilize multiple methods. So the business should always take precedent, right? If your business KPIs are struggling, if your P&L is going down, it doesn't matter what any kind of marketing measurement is telling you. That always should take precedent, and everything should waterfall from there. Classic example of that is, hey, my in-platform ROAS looks great, but my blended MER, my total revenue divided by total marketing expense, is going down and down and down and down. My revenue is not changing, but my cost is going up. That's a disconnect between an attribution platform measurement and a business KPI. And in that case, I would advise that client, well, hey, cut back on spending, stop spending more. Doesn't matter that your marketing platform is telling you it's successful if your business is not generating that incremental revenue, right? And so then in that situation, well, how do you determine which is right? Because there could be other factors that are causing the business's revenue to decline. Maybe their repeat revenue is down. Maybe they have some competitor that's coming in. Maybe the economic climate is difficult, whatever. That very well could be true. You don't want to just jump to a conclusion. So how do you do that? Well, you go through this validation process. And this validation is, again, and we'll talk about this in more detail today, but again, focused on experiments through scientific rigor and analytical models through things like media mix modeling. And if multiple of these data sets tell the same story, then you're able to make a more confident decision and consult with your teams, consult with your agencies, your brands, whoever is kind of the decision maker. Okay, this is actually very likely to be the truth. Let's move forward in this direction. So in that example of the brand where their marketing platform is telling them it's really doing well, but their business P&L is struggling, if we were to validate that actually their marketing is not contributing to the overall success of the business, then that corroborates our hypothesis that, yeah, marketing is probably being over-credited in an attribution framework, and we need to modify or adjust that attribution framework going forward. And so when do you need to validate? Because that's a common question. A lot of people hear this talk track. They will follow me on LinkedIn. They'll talk to Rockerbox people. They'll talk to other kind of measurement tools and practitioners. And the question comes up was like, well, when do I need what? Because I'm just a brand that is XYZ. And so this is just Ben's opinion, but generally where I see the greatest need for validation is the more complex your marketing is and the more complex and established your business is. So the way to think about this is sort of a maturity model where the more nascent your brand, if you're a smaller brand, sub 8 figures generally, or low 8 figures in revenue, so that's like around $10 million or less, and you have a pretty simple marketing program, so you're spending, $1 million or $2 million in Google and Facebook, you probably don't need to go through a whole lot of crazy media mix modeling and experimentation. You could probably rely on some pretty basic attribution methods and just sort of the out-of-the-box solutions that are out there. But if you're a bigger brand, let's say you're 20 million, 40 million, 60 million, 100 million, et cetera, the bigger you are, the more likely you are to have cannibalization. So marketing channels that actually compete with each other and are wasteful, or there's a potential for synergistic impact where it's the reverse of cannibalization. You have multiple marketing channels that maybe in isolation don't look very good, but in combination work really, really well. And so there's this little framework here on the left that I look at. If you're operating more than 3 paid channels, so if you're just on Google and Facebook, edge case, but let's say you're on Google, Facebook, TikTok, and programmatic. Okay, that's interesting. You actually have a media mix now where you maybe want to start looking at what is this sort of cannibalistic or synergistic effects of those. If a large percentage or the majority of your revenue comes from organic channels, so you have a lot of people coming in through non-paid efforts like SEO or just through direct traffic or through email or other kinds of methods that are earned or owned media, then the question becomes, well, is that actually because of my earned or owned media, or is there a halo effect being driven from advertising that is synergizing with those earned medias? And so you see this all the time, like with SEO, maybe your business, 80% of your traffic and revenue is coming from SEO, but a lot of that SEO demand is actually being driven from advertising. And so you want to find that out, because if you make the decision, hey, we're just going to continue to invest in SEO and pull back in ads, all of a sudden your SEO traffic plummets. Well, that's because they have a synergy together. Same story with repeat, right? If you have a big amount of repeat revenue coming, then validation is more important, because the impact of new customer acquisition, as well as the lifetime value and the repeat revenue and the kind of the viral coefficient. So sometimes people call that the K value. It's how many people a customer brings in additionally through word of mouth or through repeat revenue. That sort of growth funnel is important to identify. What is the incremental cost to actually acquire a new customer, especially if they have a long tail of LTV. So if you have high repeat business, then nailing marketing validation is really important. Generally 50 million is like a must, in my opinion. If you're at 50 million or more a year in revenue, you really need, it doesn't hurt you to do validation. It's not that disruptive, but it is definitely painful if you don't do it. And then finally, if you're running larger, what traditionally might be called brand initiatives, so you're doing a big PR push, big linear TV push, you've got out of home, you're doing event sponsorships, you're doing webinars, things like that that are difficult to track, then again, you want to have a sort of a framework to measure the impact of that. So the more of these little check marks on the left that you have, more likely you should probably be doing this form of validation, even now in late Q3, before you really invest a ton in Q4. So otherwise, you might leave opportunities on the table, or you might actually be over investing and wasting a lot of money and hurt your profit margins. So how do we get that from a testing perspective? Well, you have to also prioritize what are the things that are going to make the biggest impact? What are the biggest questions I have to answer? So let's assume that you're going to validate. Well, what do I validate first? And so we look at this as this sort of measurement waterfall or testing waterfall. And to me, you want stuff that is going to be quick, but also highly impactful. So in general, that's your total marketing program, especially from an advertising perspective. Well, that's just the blended ROI of my total marketing program. And that's different from like your MER, because your MER doesn't factor in things like incrementality. The point of this is to get to the bottom of what is the actual amount of revenue that's being driven by my marketing program. Say that you do that test, okay, that looks good. But there's probably some channels in your mix that are very successful and some channels in your mix that are not successful, right? And again, coming back to that very first slide, what's the point of measurement is to identify opportunities and to eliminate waste. So this kind of works down to more and more granular tweaks. You start off with a big, chunky, hairy question, and then over time you crunch down. So think about your business. Where are you prioritizing your spend? Where are you the most skeptical? Is there something that you're spending a lot on and you're like, data suggests it's going well, but my intuition as a practitioner is that something is off? Or you have a reverse hypothesis and you really want to double down into something, but there's something holding you back from doing that. You see this a lot with TikTok right now. People are like, I know my audience is on TikTok. I know I should be there for Q4. I know I want to invest in there, but the platform attribution just looks so bad. I'm hesitant to invest in that. And so that's when you are able to elevate and bubble those questions up to the top of this list. But this is just a kind of a recommended generic order of, if I'm going to validate, what order do I answer those questions in? So to recap the measurement framework piece and why diversified measurement is important before we get into some actual practical tactics and how-tos on the validation side is really three things. Number one is every kind of major business decision should align with a business KPI. The P&L is the single source of truth, right? I'm quoted as saying the single source of truth is dead. Asterisk, the P&L is the single source of truth. So if your contribution margin is good, if your LTV to CAC is good, if your revenue is good and you're on track, that's priority number one. If the reverse of that is the case, then you really need to figure out what's going on there and get more conservative and fast. Number two, more tactical changes, things where you're like, okay, I'm going to reallocate budgets from this tactic to this tactic, or within Meta, how much do I do in advantage shopping versus DPAs, whatever, stuff like that. Those are fine to use more traditional attribution-based decisions or smaller tactics. Now, if you've done an experiment where you've validated that a given particular tactic is really successful over another, then that's great. But in the day-to-day management, it's probably fine if number one has been solved for. And then for number three, if you're a more sophisticated business, when I say sophisticated, I don't mean that in a judgmental way, but if you only sell one SKU and you only are on one marketing channel, it's probably not a lot to test, right? But if you're selling 100 SKUs and you're on 6 marketing channels, well, there's a lot of things to figure out with that type of business model. And so you really need to go through this validation exercise to determine what is actually incrementally driving revenue versus what's not. So how do we do that? How do you validate the performance and the incremental impact of different marketing? And this is where we really get into sort of the practical how-to steps of it and methods. So what's the point of validation? Really, it's what's my marketing contribute, and then overall, and then specifically, what are the channels or tactics contribute to the overall? Because in any program, you're going to have above average and below average contributors, and you want to raise the floor on those below average ones. You want to improve or optimize or reduce those, and you want to continue to invest in those above the average channels as well. So there's really two ways. And the first one that I like to do is a geographic based test and control. It's sometimes called a matched market test or a geo test, sometimes abbreviated as MMT or GeoX. What this does is really it looks at a classic scientific test and control methodology where you have an A group and a B group, or sometimes multiple letters. And those are as predictive and as similar and as correlated as possible for your overall business impact, as well as the way that you've traditionally marketed into them. When you are marketing into them, how do you change or introduce an experiment that gives you very statistically significant, high confidence interval results? So the classic example of this is that we have market A and market B. Market A, we're running very similar revenue to market B. You can see that trend line. But at a certain date, so say like at the beginning of October, we turn off all of our ads in market A, but we keep all of our ads running in market B. As you can see, revenue continues to grow in market B. It's trending consistently trending up, but over time, market A starts to decline over those next couple of weeks. And so what this tells us then is what is the difference after we've introduced that experiment? And that total revenue impact is the incrementality. So this is my preferred method for geo-targetable paid programs. So think Google, Meta, TikTok, YouTube, connected TV, things like that, where it's easy to target. There's two ways to do this. One is you can heavy up in a market. So if you're running on a national program, you layer an additional heavier budget in one market. The reverse is the other way. It's a holdout group or exclusion group where you're running at a national program and you reduce budget from a market and you compare that to a baseline. A couple of things to watch out with this. It's really, really important. And what makes it different than just a pre-post test or an in-platform A/B test is that you really need to have accurate market pairing. And so what I mean by that is they need to be very similar and predictive of each other. And the best way to do that really is through data science modeling. There's a couple of open source tools out on the internet if you want to look up, Python or R-based scripts. There's the famous one from Google where there's a lot of scripts that have been subsequently developed past that. Power Digital has our own proprietary one. There's a lot of platforms out there that do it. But in short, you really want to make sure that your markets are very predictive of each other in terms of whatever the total business impact is. Generally, that's revenue. Sometimes it could be customers. It could be leads. It could be whatever your main business KPI is. So that's one watch out. The other watch out is that it's naturally going to be slower and disruptive. So what I mean by that is that you're introducing a new experiment, a new normal into a group of customers. And those customer behaviors it's not gonna change overnight. It's gonna take time for this sort of latent effect of this experiment to really take hold. And sometimes you'll see more scientific tests will have like a cool down or a ramp up period where they establish what the new baseline is and then they measure. And that's because humans aren't like, oh, I saw an ad and I immediately bought that day. It's more like, oh, yeah, I've been seeing them all over the place for the last 6 months. That last 6 months of recollection is going to carry on through the next couple of weeks or months even. And so this can be a more slow test. Now, if your business is a product that is more of an impulse buy, so usually a lower AOV product, think like clothing or soft goods, something like that. Oh, yeah, that looks cool. I'll buy that. Sunglasses, whatever. Then usually you can get to the bottom of these types of tests very quickly, like a couple of weeks. If you are a higher AOV or a more personal or a long consideration cycle product, like a furniture or a car or something like that, obviously it's going to be a much, much longer window. So for Q3, Q4 timing, it's probably too late. But if you're a brand, like a normal sort of Shopify e-commerce brand, sub $200 AOV, then you still have time in September and early October to run this type of test. But it does require the commitment to sticking to this process, right? So that's where the disruption is. Your normal business as usual sort of marketing efforts need to be paused in order or maintain the status quo in order for you to minimize the noise in the test. So here's an example of what that looks like. This is some real data. In this brand, the question was CTV really struggles from an attribution lens. It's very hard to track users because it's not necessarily tied to device IDs. It's more at the IP address level. It's difficult to click unless you're doing like a QR code or something. So from an attribution perspective, CTV usually looks very bad from a cost per conversion, or in this case, a CPA standpoint. But when we ran this match market test, where we actually had a concentrated effort of CTV running in a couple of smaller markets, we saw then comparing those markets to a predictive control group, there was a significant jump. And so we were able to calculate with a 97% confidence that the incremental cost per conversion, the ICPA, was about $105. Compared that to their attribution, it was almost $1,000 for a CPA. So in this example, you could see the incrementality was almost 10x more than what the traditional tech-based attribution tool was telling them. And so if they had relied on that traditional tech-based attribution tool, that brand would have not invested in Q4 and would have not invested in this spike period. It was Q1, not invested in this spike period. But now they know we're able to get a great return, 10x better return than we thought we were getting on CTV. And so they continue to invest, and they've done great things with that. The second method, so that was the first, is experimentation. The second method is modeling and data science. This is the A in the BEATS acronym. And so media mix modeling is the most common of these, and this has been around forever, right? It's probably 60 plus years at this point. And MMM really is just a fancy method for a program to find correlations over time. There's a lot of methods to this. There's various mathematical formulas that make certain models different from each other. I won't get into the weeds on that, but basically it's finding what does one input affect an alternate output, right? And how do these different inputs interact with each other? You could look at relationships such as spend and revenue, or spend and brand demand, or overall marketing effort, if you can quantify that in some way, such as your OpEx costs towards marketing, or work with an agency or something like that, and use that to measure what's the ROI or the impact on that from a modeling perspective. Now, the downside with media mix modeling is that it's retroactive, and it's going to be kind of applying that looking forward. And so as things change in the market, it's not necessarily going to maintain consistency. And it's the same thing is true for experimentation, right? It's a snapshot in time right now, but it's not necessarily predicting what it will be like in the future. And so with this, it's also going to typically be less granular, less tactical in terms of what it can attribute success to. However, there are ways to get MMM models more and more tactical and granular with kind of more modern technologies. And again, like the tool that Rockerbox is using is able to get to a pretty good level of granularity and resolution. So how does it work? Basically, you look at a series of repeating learning models where they say, okay, we're going to guess that this tactic or this channel has this ROI, and this tactic or this channel has this ROI. And we're going to try to map that out over all the ebbs and flows of revenue, total revenue for the business in this case. And then we're going to measure how accurate is that first attempt, how predictive is that first attempt, and you back test that accuracy. First model, it's not so good. Okay, we learned something though. We're going to do it again. Second model, a little closer, but still not good. Model 3, model 4, model 5, blah, 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 blah. And in this fake example, model 47 becomes the line of best fit. So it's figured out over time. In real media mix models driven by machine learning, there might be thousands of iterations or tens of thousands of iterations where it's looking at every possible computation that it can figure out to figure out what is the most likely answer to get us the closest to predicting accurately what the impact is of different channels or different tactics. And so once you find that model of best fit, that line of best fit, usually it will be reported out as some sort of error percentage. Sometimes you'll hear the term MAPE, which is an acronym for mean absolute percent error. It just means on either side of reality, how kind of far off is it? The lower that number, the better. And so once it finds that, then you have more confidence in saying, oh, well, actually, the ROI of this tactic is higher than I thought. Going back to the earlier example before with CTV, if they had done a media mix model of CTV, if the model was, you know, scientific and accurate, it would have determined similar results to the experiment and said, oh, actually, your CTV ROI is much higher than your current attribution model is. Now, the nice thing with both of these techniques is they go together. So you can use experiments to inform and calibrate your model, and then use that model to, in turn, inform and calibrate your attribution for your tactical level. And so doing this sort of Beats waterfall effect allows you to have an accurate attribution methodology that is driven through the combination of scientific experiments as well as data science media mix modeling. And so what that would look like, this is a very oversimplification. Rockerbox's UI is a lot prettier than this and more useful, but this, for demonstration purposes, this will show you, for example, okay, you're spending X, but your impact has an outsized effect Y. So like Google bottom of funnel, Facebook middle of funnel in this example are showing that the impact significantly, the incremental revenue significantly is higher than the share of their spend. And so the model would then suggest, okay, well, we want to reallocate, we want to divest from some of these lower impact ones where the reverse is true. Like, for example, Facebook top of funnel, where there's a high spend index and a low impact index. We want to flip flop that and reallocate into something that is more incremental. And so that change flips over to something like this. And so a media mix model and a scenario plan, you can go through these kind of iterations, and the combination of the technology and a smart marketer and all the kind of institutional and business context and knowledge combined to create, what the ideal sort of media mix or methodology looks like. So just to recap, appreciate you all listening to me here for the last 37 minutes or so. But really, there's no single source of truth, right? The single source of truth is dead. You can't rely on a single tool anymore, and arguably you never could, except for maybe the business P&L. But you need to look at a combination of factors in order to triangulate what's true. Now, inevitably, those different methods are going to disagree with each other. You're going to have scenarios where version A looks almost directly contradictory to version B. Attribution looks different from modeling. Modeling looks different from experiments. My business P&L looks different than my post-purchase surveys, whatever. And so having a prioritization framework, and feel free to steal the Beats model if you like that, go ahead and use that, but come up with a prioritization framework of this is the order of operations that we're going to defer to. So if something contradicts with something else, which one takes precedent, rock, paper, scissors style? And then for brands that need it, which again is not all brands, but if you're a bigger brand, solid 8 figures, more complex media mix, and you're starting to have doubts or questions around the impact of your marketing, then the combination of validation techniques of experiments and data science driven analytics will be useful to validate that and determine what your attribution and retroactive kind of credit should look like by tactic. So appreciate you all listening. That's what I have for today. I'd be happy. I think we have another 10 minutes or so. So be happy to answer any questions if there are. If not, hopefully all of you can go and enjoy a coffee or something, waiting for the next one to hop in. But I'll be hanging out here for the next 10, 15 minutes, and feel free to pop any questions in the chat. I'd love to chat through it. While I wait, I'll tell you all a story. Yeah, thanks to Amanda. We actually had a client that went through this exact process. Very historically heavy spender in Meta, which nothing against Meta. I think Meta's a great platform. And they were spending pretty high percentage of revenue, like 35% of revenue. And we ended up finding enough waste in their program, both in Meta and in some of their other channels, Google, a little bit of influencer, and a little bit of other programmatic channels, that we ended up cutting their spend by a significant amount, almost like 40%, or actually more than 40%. And we were able to maintain their total revenue. So huge cost savings, right, that came to the bottom line. So this type of, and this was for a solid 8-figure, low 9-figure brand. So this is a significant cost savings, tens of millions of dollars over the course of a 12-month run rate. So yeah, Ed, mentioned a stat that only 2% of digital ads get clicked on. So that is based on the aggregated click-through rate data. You see that occasionally get published by various sources, eMarketer, Statista. I have corroborated that with my own clients' data. All of Power Digital's clickable ads roughly are 2%. Depends on the channel, depends on the industry. B2B tends to be lower. D2C tends to be higher. Certain channels are higher than others. Obviously, a channel like brand search is going to have, 10%, 20% click-through rate, whereas programmatic display ads on a mobile phone is going to have a 0.05 or something super, super small. So in the grand scheme of things, it pretty consistently for the last 10 years, it's averaged at around a 2% click-through rate. Yeah, and Zach, how are you handling Meta pushing more to their shop since it's much harder to track? Well, I think that's a specific nuance of any kind of larger diversified revenue stream. So if you see this a lot with brands that they're sold on Amazon as well as .com. They're sold in a retail media network. They're sold in brick and mortar even. And all of this, kind of the more diversified your revenue streams are, the more important it is for you. And let me just kick up this recap here again so that people can look at that instead of a thank you screen. You need to tie that back to the P&L. So having really good financial KPI tracking, and then being able to tie back, okay, we did this experiment. What was our impact on Facebook shops? Harder to track for sure at an ad level, but you can still get that revenue data back. Then you can say, okay, this is that. Now, in some cases, you can't geotest something. Like certain types of channels, like influencer, you can't geotest. PR can't geotest, right? So in those experiments, you need to do something more like a causal impact analysis or some other sort of A/B test. Maybe it's done at the product level, like we're only going to push a certain kind of product to our Amazon store, and then we're going to push another product online, and we're going to measure the total product sales and use that as sort of the business KPI that you're measuring against. So not a great answer, but my whole thesis of this argument is there is no great single answer on these anymore. It's that we all have to kind of get comfortable with some ambiguity. So Paul, how do you approach longer consideration products with a high AOV? How much time do you recommend for an effective experiment? Yeah, I mentioned this briefly, but it's good to spend some time there. So the classic answer, I'm a trained media planner by trade. That's where I come from. Classic answer is 2 consideration cycles, which is sort of a fluffy way of saying whatever we think or have proven ideally, how long from exposure to purchase somebody takes to buy. So usually when you look at that, you can just straight up ask customers, how long have you been researching this? That's where surveys come in handy. For cars, you often see the answer could be years. It could be 6 months, 18 months, 24 months, whatever. For most things like furniture, it might be they had it in their mind for a while, like, yeah, I kind of need a new couch for the past year, but they really were only actively researching for maybe 30 days. And so 2 consideration cycles in that case, would be 60 days. For probably 85% of brands I've worked with, or even maybe 90% of brands I've worked with, usually a 30-day test is enough for you to get, if not a full, stable, baked answer, a kind of close enough answer that gives you directional confidence, like, hey, this isn't working at all, or this is working great. And if it's either of those sort of extreme scenarios, you make the same decision versus if it was a 1.2 ROI versus a 1.1 ROI. I don't know that that's enough of a difference for you to make a decision. But if it's a 10 ROI versus a 1 ROI, you're like, okay, yeah, a 10 ROI definitely requires me to invest more here. Even if eventually it got to 11, 10 versus 11 doesn't probably make that much of a difference to your business. Sudeep Da, hey Ben, is there actually a notable difference between media mix modeling and marketing mix modeling? If so, can you talk about it? Yeah, the terms are sort of used interchangeably, and I'm pretty bad about keeping them distinct. Marketing mix modeling generally factors in more types of marketing activity. I would say in the modern nomenclature, the distinction, there's probably some data science nerds out there that'll get mad at me, but I would say the distinction is largely arbitrary now. Probably used to mean something more 10, 20 years ago. Traditionally, media mix modeling was more like, what's my advertising efforts? or specific media activities, like I'm running TV campaigns, I'm running radio campaigns, things like that. Marketing is like things inclusive of PR, or we hired these people to go and do some sort of marketing activity, some guerrilla event, or we paid for a webinar, or we paid for whatever. Those things are more like marketing and less media, but I don't think there's a big distinction anymore. It's sort of just whatever term you use. If anybody disagrees, I'd love to hear about that, but I think it's largely irrelevant. Ashish asks, majority of e-commerce brands go on flash sale during holiday. How do you get more sales compared to last year on the same? And how do you predict how much inventory will get sold? A lot of that, I mean, that's a complicated question. There's a couple of different components in that. When you go on a flash sale, the year-over-year comparison really depends on how you're tracking that. Is it year-over-year revenue? Is it year-over-year margin? Is it year-over-year customers? And there's so many different ways that you could do that. If you're doing a sale, typically that sale is more of a, okay, for margins, say you're optimizing margin, right? If you are more promotional, so you're having a deeper discount year-over-year, the hypothesis, business justification of that is that your conversion rate will increase because you're a more compelling offer. So let's say last year you did 20% off, this year you're doing 30% off. That's a 50% increase in your promo. And let's say, just for easy math, that it also is a 50% worse hit into your contribution margin. That means that in order for that to be successful, your conversion rate has to be 50% better, or your CAC, basically your cost to acquire that customer, has to be 50% more efficient. I'm skeptical that would be the case. Now, maybe it could be, but that's sort of the hypothesis, right? It's the whole point of a promo is that you're convincing people to buy. And so promo optimizations, and that's really where testing earlier in the year. And like right now, potentially a way to test that out would be to send emails to your current customers. And like systems like Klaviyo can do this for you, where you can develop randomized control tests between a cohort and another cohort that are very similar in size and shopping behavior. And you can say, okay, I'm going to send a promo email to cohort A and just a reminder email to cohort B, and see what the impact is. And if the conversion rate, it's different from email versus acquisition, I get that, but just directionally, if the conversion rate is not significantly better in the promo email group, then it's probably not worth it. And so the real way to get more margin then is to either get more customers, right? Which potentially means that you're going to spend more on a CAC perspective or an investment perspective, or you have to get more value from your customers. Those are really the only two ways to get revenue: more customers or more value from your customers. And so if you're trying to get more value from your customers, it might be more of a retention strategy. It could be a pricing strategy. Maybe you do a buy more, save more, or a bundle. There's lots of ways to unwrap that. Perfect. Any other questions? I know you guys are probably sick of hearing me talk for 50 minutes, but any last questions here for the group? And if you have something that's maybe more complicated or longer one-on-one, feel free to reach out to me directly, or to hit up the Rockerbox folks and they can connect us. But any last questions? I'm anticipating people are furiously typing. Maybe not. All right. Well, I appreciate all the time and attention and good conversation. And thank you hugely to Maggie and Ashley and the Rockerbox team for having me on again. And it's always fun to do these conversations.
Yeah, thank you, Ben. That was a great session. And judging based on the questions, everyone really loved it as well. Yeah, so thanks for being on to present again.
Of course. Yeah. Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it was amazing. I think that like one of the things that you said on one of the earlier slides, I actually wrote it down because I was like, oh my gosh, we need to like bottle this up. And like, Ben, I feel like your sessions are always like that, but you said understanding both attribution and contribution requires the use of a constellation of measurement tools to optimize towards driving incremental revenue, not just winning at attribution. And I think that that is so good. And ultimately, I think that that concept was just framed perfectly in the different frameworks that you presented. and also kind of like walking through these really tactical steps that brands can take to really better understand the impact of their marketing. So like Maggie said, your sessions are always wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sure that we will continue to get wonderful feedback after the fact. But I know that we are coming up on our next session. So Maggie, tell me a little bit about what's coming up
Yeah, we're going to
next.
hop over and join our friends at Tenuity and talk about a lot of things: seasonality, OTT, linear measurement. It's good. It's a great session. I've seen the slides. So yeah, you should have got an email already to hop into that, or just join through the link in your calendar. And that's about it. We will see you guys over there. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.